A father and son vanished without a trace in the scorching Arizona desert. No calls, no clues, just a worn-out truck found miles from anywhere. For 4 long years, their fate remained a heartbreaking mystery, until a violent storm unearthed something that would shatter everything their family thought they knew. This is a story of love, survival, sacrifice, and the incredible truth the desert kept hidden. Before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Just drop your city or country and say hi. Now, let's dive into the story. The morning Michael Harris and his 10-year-old son Ethan left for their camping trip, the Arizona sky stretched wide and blue above them, promising warmth and adventure. It was the kind of morning that made you forget danger ever existed. Michael, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a weather-worn face and calm, deliberate movements, had always found peace in the desert. After losing his wife to cancer 3 years earlier, he'd turned to the wilderness for healing, bringing Ethan along on hikes and weekend trips to teach him about the land and, maybe more quietly, about resilience. This trip was supposed to be simpler. Night camp in the Sonoran Desert, just outside of Saguaro National Park. They packed light but prepared. Trail mix, 2 gallons of water, a compass, a map, Michael's trusty pocket knife, and Ethan's red sleeping bag rolled tightly beside his pack. They waved goodbye to Karen, Michael's sister-in-law, who lived just 2 blocks away. She stood at the curb with her arms folded, watching them with a nervous smile, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. She had always worried more than most, especially after her sister passed. Michael had reassured her with a hug and that quiet confidence of his. "We'll be back Sunday by noon. I promise," he'd said. But Sunday came and went, and no one returned. When Monday morning arrived and Karen still hadn't heard from them, she drove the back roads toward the edge of the desert, hoping to see Michael's old Ford parked at one of the trailheads. But every lot was empty. No footprints near the sand, no tire tracks fresh enough to follow. That's when her worry shifted to panic. By noon, she was calling the sheriff's department, and within hours, a formal search was underway. The first 48 hours saw helicopters sweeping across miles of scorched earth, while volunteers, rangers, and tracking dogs combed the rugged trails. The desert stretched endlessly, a sea of rock and sagebrush, hiding its secrets beneath the sun's blistering glare. At night, temperatures dropped sharply, and the wind howled like a ghost. Everyone feared the worst. Karen rode out every search trip, standing beside the sheriff with her arms wrapped around herself, watching the horizon as if willing them to walk out of it. But there was no sign, no distress signal, no campsite, no overturned gear. It was as if Michael and Ethan had been swallowed whole by the earth. The only trace was a partial footprint near a dried arroyo, but it was too faded to identify. Days turned into weeks, and the search scaled back. The media swarmed in, reporters asking questions Karen didn't know how to answer. Some of them painted Michael as a hero father lost to the wild. Others hinted at darker possibilities. Why would an experienced hiker vanish in a place he knew so well? Had he fallen into a canyon? Had someone found them out there and done something terrible? The questions were a torment. By the 3rd week, a quiet settled over the Khasan, unbearable silence. The headlines faded. The searchers moved on. But Karen couldn't. She clung to the last voicemail Michael had left on her phone, a simple message saying they'd made it to the site and that Ethan had just finished pitching their tent. His voice was calm, the wind rustling faintly in the background. That was the last time she ever heard him. Back in town, people whispered. Some believed they'd gotten lost and perished. Others suggested Michael had snapped under grief and taken Ethan into the desert to die. Karen bristled at those suggestions, defending Michael with a fierceness that sometimes bordered on desperation. He loved that boy, she told anyone who would listen. He wouldn't hurt him, not ever. Still, doubt crept in during the quiet hours of the night. She'd sit on her porch long after sunset, staring out into the darkness, replaying every conversation, every visit, wondering if she'd missed something, a word, a look, a hidden sadness. Had Michael been planning something? Had he known he wasn't coming back? The sheriff offered her condolences, but his eyes had the look of a man who'd seen this story too many times. "The desert doesn't give up its dead easily," he said, "but it never forgets." Karen never stopped hoping. Every birthday, she left a small wrapped gift on the porch, just in case. Every year, she bought Ethan a new pair of sneakers in his size. She even kept a drawer in her kitchen stocked with his favorite peanut butter crackers. Hope, for her, became a ritual. 4 years passed. The desert remained silent, but the wind was always whispering. Somewhere, she believed, Michael's promise still echoed in the canyons. "We'll be back by Sunday," he'd said. And though that Sunday never came, Karen never stopped listening for it. The first days of the search had burned themselves into Karen's memory like a scar too deep to heal. She could still smell the dry heat of the desert air mixed with the exhaust of the choppers, still feel the crunch of gravel beneath her sneakers. As she followed behind sheriff deputies calling out Michael's name, she had hoped desperately that the rangers would find them dehydrated but alive, maybe waiting beneath a rocky outcrop for help, their canteen empty but their spirits intact. After all, Michael knew what he was doing. That's what everyone kept saying, but even the most experienced man couldn't outwit time and terrain forever. The search stretched on. The days turned to a week. The choppers moved in broader circles. The scent dogs grew tired and disoriented from the heat. The volunteers came by the dozens, neighbors, hikers, friends from church, but none of them found so much as a scrap of clothing. The sun scorched the ground mercilessly, baking every rock and bush, until the world felt like it might catch fire from sheer hopelessness. The desert wasn't hiding Michael and Ethan, it had erased them. The sheriff, a man named Conrad Greeley, with a handlebar, mustache and steady voice, gave Karen updates every evening. He never sugarcoated things, and Karen both appreciated and hated that. "No new sign today," he'd say quietly, removing his hat out of respect. "We're expanding the radius tomorrow. Don't lose faith." But Karen could see it in his eyes. He was beginning to expect the worst. They all were. Even the news anchors began to use past tense when talking about Michael and Ethan. Karen noticed it like a knife each time. The father, who was an experienced hiker, or the boy who loved lizards and comic books. Every word felt like a betrayal, a burial in language before there was a body. And then came the rumors. When a story like this lingers in the heat too long without answers, people start spinning their own. Some townsfolk began whispering in the grocery store line, murmuring things they wouldn't dare say to her face. Some wondered if Michael had decided to end it all, if grief had hollowed him out so deeply he'd taken Ethan with him into some remote canyon, never planning to come back. Others speculated that he had enemies, people he owed money to, perhaps, or a dark secret from the war. Maybe they'd never even gone to the desert at all. Karen hated every theory. She clung to the voicemail, replaying Michael's voice over and over, hoping to catch some hidden clue in his tone. But there was only calm, only Michael, only the sound of Ethan laughing faintly in the background as the message ended. She refused to let the narrative be rewritten. She gave interviews to local radio stations, saying how devoted Michael was, how tender he had been with Ethan. She showed photos Michael teaching Ethan how to start a fire safely, Michael brushing dust off a desert flower so Ethan could smell it. "A man like that doesn't just lose his way," she said. "He doesn't vanish." But there was one moment, one terrible moment, that shook her belief. It was late in the second week. A park ranger returned from a solo sweep of a dry riverbed with something wrapped in a handkerchief. It was a child's water bottle, scuffed and faded, the kind with little superhero stickers peeling from the side. Karen recognized it instantly. Her knees buckled when she held it. But the ranger cautioned her gently it didn't prove anything. The desert swallowed objects from all over. It could have been dropped years ago. Still, it felt like a cruel reminder, a whisper from the sand. They had been here, and now they were gone. After 2 full weeks with no new evidence, and no signs of struggle or survival, the sheriff made a devastating announcement. The search would be officially suspended. The resources had been exhausted. They'd continue to follow up on any new leads, but the active effort had come to an end. Karen felt her body go cold as he said the words at a press conference. Cameras clicked. People murmured, but she heard nothing except the sound of finality. It was like watching the last lifeboat row away from a sinking ship. That night, alone in her house, she didn't cry. She sat at the kitchen table in silence, Michael's last message playing on a loop beside her. She couldn't accept that this was it. The desert might have stopped speaking to the sheriff, but not to her. Somewhere out there, Michael and Ethan were still waiting to be found, whether in life or in memory. She would not let them become ghosts. She went to the sheriff's office the next morning and asked for the map of the last known coordinates. She marked it with a red pen, then another circle around the area where the water bottle had been found. She studied the terrain, traced the possible paths they might have taken. If no one else was going to keep looking, she would, and she would not stop until the desert gave her something more than silence. In the weeks that followed the official suspension of the search, a strange kind of hush fell over the small town of Gila Bend. At first, it was a respectful silence, the kind that settles after tragedy, when people don't quite know what to say. Porch lights were left on at night, candles flickered in windows, and neighbors dropped off casseroles at Karen's door without knocking. At church, the congregation bowed their heads a little longer during the prayers, and when Ethan's name was spoken aloud from the pulpit, many had to wipe their eyes. But as summer dragged into fall, grief began to change its shape. The warmth faded from people's eyes. Whispers returned, low at first, then gradually louder. That's the thing about a mystery left to fester in the desert. It breeds theories, and theories breed rumors, and rumors, no matter how cruel, always find a voice. At the corner diner, where old men gathered every morning for coffee and gossip, someone mentioned how odd it was that Michael hadn't left behind a proper itinerary. Another claimed they'd seen him arguing with a stranger at the gas station the day before the trip. A woman at the pharmacy said she overheard Michael talking about starting fresh, though she couldn't say where or why. No one knew what was true, but that hardly seemed to matter. As the days wore on and no answers came, suspicion became easier than sorrow. Karen noticed it first at the grocery store. People stopped looking her in the eye. Some offered tight smiles, others just turned away. Even the school staff, once eager to comfort her, now spoke to her in careful, measured tones. It was as though the town had placed Michael in a box labeled unresolved, and with it, Ethan too. The narrative had begun to shift, and it tore at Karen's heart. She did her best to keep her composure, but some nights she found herself staring at her reflection, wondering if she had truly known Michael at all. That's what grief does. It asks questions you never thought to ask, pushes doubts into corners you once trusted without hesitation. But then she would remember how he held Ethan's hand when they crossed the street, how he stayed up with him when he had nightmares, whispering stories about stars and coyotes until the boy drifted off. That was not the man of the rumors. That was her brother-in-law, her friend, a father who had weathered his wife's death with quiet strength and turned his sorrow into something gentle. He wasn't perfect. He had moments of silence too deep to understand eyes that sometimes stared through people as though chasing ghosts, but he loved Ethan. That Karen believed with every beat of her heart was true. Still, the world around her kept changing. Ethan's school replaced his desk with another student's name. His baseball glove was boxed up and returned. The church stopped including the family in weekly prayers. Even the sheriff's department, once sympathetic, moved on to other cases, other emergencies. When Karen called to follow up, she was met with polite indifference. "We'll let you know if anything turns up," they'd say, and that was that. The cold, hard fact was this: without new evidence, there would be no justice, no answers. The desert had swallowed a man and his boy, and the world had chosen to forget them. Karen couldn't forget. She wouldn't. She turned her spare room into a kind of shrine, not out of superstition, but memory. The room still held Ethan's drawing spaceships and snakes, and a goofy portrait of his dad with lopsided eyes. On the desk sat Michael's old trail maps, the corners worn soft from use. Every few nights she'd sit in that room with a cup of tea and run her fingers over the pencil lines he'd drawn, the circled trailheads, the little notes he'd scribbled. "Watch for snakes here, great view at sunset." It was a map of his mind, a trail into who he was. Sometimes she cried. Sometimes she simply sat, listening to the silence, as if it might whisper something back. One evening, while watching the sky turn orange over the saguaros, she overheard two young hikers at the gas station talking about Michael. One of them laughed nervously, saying, "You heard what they say, right? That he faked it, wanted to disappear, took the kid, and ran." The other nodded like it was gospel truth. Karen didn't confront them. She simply walked to her car, her hands shaking, her eyes burning. They didn't know the man they were talking about. They hadn't seen the way he carried Ethan on his shoulders when his little legs got tired, or how he sat beside his wife's grave every Sunday with fresh flowers. The world was so quick to believe the worst, but Karen still believed in the man he had been, and she believed Ethan was out there somewhere, waiting. She had to, because if she stopped believing, then the desert had won, and she wasn't ready to let go. Autumn came and went, and with it, the last flickers of public interest in Michael and Ethan's disappearance faded like the cooling desert wind. But for Karen, the passing seasons only sharpened her resolve. Something inside her refused to quiet down, a persistent ache in her chest that wouldn't let her sit still. She had always believed in order, in process, in trusting the system to do its job, but now, that trust felt like a betrayal. The sheriff's office had closed the file, neighbors had closed their doors, and the world had moved on. But Karen couldn't, she wouldn't. So one quiet morning, she opened Michael's old storage trunk, the one he kept in the garage under an army blanket. Inside were journals, trail maps, photos from previous hikes, and a small collection of camping gear labeled with masking tape. She ran her fingers over his notes, tracing the paths he had once planned with precision and care. In the bottom of the trunk was a weathered notebook bound with a leather strap. It wasn't a diary, not quite, more like a working journal, a place where Michael had sketched routes, scribbled ideas, even jotted bits of poetry or lines from books he liked. Karen read through it slowly, absorbing his thoughts, hoping some detail might rise to the surface and shine a light into the shadows. She began to build her own map on the wall of the spare room. Red string connected places Michael had visited before. Blue pins marked confirmed sightings. A green pushpin sat where the water bottle had been found. She stared at it every night before bed, imagining what path might have led them there, where it could have led next. Her obsession didn't go unnoticed. Friends stopped calling. Some thought she was going mad. But Karen didn't mind the solitude. She needed it. She was chasing ghosts through dust and stone, and she didn't have time to explain herself. One afternoon at the local hardware store, she overheard a pair of hikers talking about a place deep in the Sonoran backcountry that few dared to visit, old, dry canyon marked only by a rusted sign half buried in sand. Locals called it Devil's Bend. The name alone sent a chill through her. She asked around, but no one knew much. It wasn't on official park maps anymore, just a footnote in older trail guides. That night, Karen drove to the library and found a tattered book about remote desert routes. Sure enough, Devil's Bend was listed, marked with a warning: unstable rock formations, unpredictable weather patterns, and dangerous terrain, a place for the foolhardy, or for someone desperate to disappear. Karen needed help if she was going to explore it. She remembered a name: Joe Dalton. He was a former tracker, now retired, who used to work with the Forest Service. Michael had mentioned him once, saying Joe could read the land like a story. He lived in a rundown cabin on the outskirts of the next county, and Karen drove there with nothing more than a thermos of coffee and the old trail map under her arm. Joe answered the door shirtless, wearing suspenders and a scowl. But when Karen explained who she was and why she had come, something softened behind his sun-wrinkled eyes. He listened without interrupting, then scratched his grizzled chin and said, "Most people give up after a year. You're 4 years deep. That means something." They set out the following week, just the two of them. Joe packed, light to light. Karen thought, but he moved with the ease of someone who'd spent his whole life walking dirt paths no one else dared to follow. For 3 days they explored narrow canyons and jagged cliffs, the sun beating down. Like judgment, they found pieces of an old tent caught on a branch, a child's baseball cap half buried in silt. Joe was cautious about drawing conclusions, but Karen knew deep in her marrow that these were not random. These were Michael and Ethan's. They had come this way. Still, the desert remained mostly silent, its secrets held beneath layers of sand and time. When they returned, Karen brought the items to the sheriff, but he dismissed them. Too weathered to be conclusive, he said with a shrug. Could belong to anyone. Karen's frustration turned to fury. She stormed out, clutching Ethan's cap to her chest like a sacred relic. Back home, she placed it on the nightstand beside his old twin bed. That night, she dreamt of Michael's voice calling across the canyons, not panicked or afraid, but patient, as if waiting for her to catch up. When she woke, her cheeks were wet with tears. She and Joe continued their excursions over the months that followed. Sometimes they found nothing. Other times, they found subtle sign scratches on rocks, faded footprints, the faint remains of a long-dead fire pit. Joe taught her how to read the land the way Michael must have, how to follow water lines and wind trails. She started to understand why Michael had loved it out here, why he felt at home among the silence and space. But that understanding only deepened the ache in her chest. The more she walked in his footsteps, the more she missed him. Then one evening, while reviewing drone footage of the area after a recent thunderstorm, Karen noticed something, a small glint in the canyon where the sunlight had hit metal. It was too small to be a car, too angular to be rock. She leaned in closer, her pulse rising. It was something, and the desert, finally, seemed ready to speak. In the early spring of the 4th year since Michael and Ethan vanished, the skies over southern Arizona grew dark and restless. Locals spoke of it with a kind of nervous thunder rolling in from the mountains, lightning carving the night sky into jagged scars, and rain falling in a way it hadn't for decades. The Sonoran Desert, so long parched and silent, was about to remember. The storm came suddenly, breaking across the land like a furious tide. Flash floods tore through dry riverbeds, walls of muddy water rushing into hidden ravines and forgotten gullies. Rockslides collapsed old paths, and canyons that hadn't seen moisture in years drank deep from the heavens. The desert was changing, rearranging itself, revealing the bones it had buried. Karen sat by her window as the storm raged outside, watching rain streak across the glass and tracing the lightning strikes in the distance. Something stirred in her chest, a quiet intuition, not unlike a whisper she couldn't quite hear. She didn't know why, but she sensed that this storm wasn't just another flash flood. It felt like an undoing, a reckoning, like the desert had held its breath for too long and now was finally ready to speak. 2 days later, the phone rang. It was a park ranger named Eli Torres, someone Karen had spoken to occasionally during her solo search efforts. His voice trembled with cautious energy. "We found something," he said, "washed out of a canyon about 20 miles north of Devil's Bend. Might be worth a look." Karen didn't hesitate. She packed a bag and called Joe, who was already halfway into his boots by the time she reached him. The next morning, under a clear sky and air still thick with the scent of wet mesquite, they drove out to the ranger's station. Eli met them with a grave nod and led them down a narrow trail, now muddy and strewn with debris. He explained that after the floods, a patrol team had discovered several objects unearthed from a collapsed arroyo, items that didn't belong there, things too modern, too human. As they walked, Karen's breath caught in her throat. The landscape looked different, now stripped bare in places, as if time had been peeled away. And then, beneath the overhang of a cliff, partially buried in damp earth and tangled roots, she saw it, a rusted knife, the handle worn smooth, the blade dulled by time. It lay beside a child's torn backpack, the fabric faded but unmistakably familiar. Karen's knees went weak. She sank down beside it, her fingers trembling as she reached for the strap. A patch was still sewn to the front, Ethan's name, written in black marker, the letters smudged but visible. It was real, it was his, and after 4 long years, the desert had finally given something back. Joe knelt beside her silently, removing his hat. For a moment, no one spoke. Even the wind seemed to hush in reverence. They returned the items to the ranger station where officials catalogued them, taking photos and samples. Karen watched every movement, her eyes locked on the backpack, as if it might vanish again. That night, she couldn't sleep. Her mind replayed the image over and over. Ethan walking with that backpack, Michael gripping that knife. Why had they been found here? What had they been running from? And why had the earth held on to their story for so long? The next day brought more discoveries. A search team equipped with metal detectors and shovels returned to the site. Just past the spot where the backpack had been found, the ground had partially caved in from the rain. Beneath it, bones, human remains, weathered and fractured but unmistakably present. 2 sets, one larger, one smaller. Karen's breath caught, her heart pounding. But it wasn't what it seemed. DNA results arrived a week later. One set belonged to Michael Harris. That part, Karen had expected. She had prepared herself for it, mourned for it across countless nights. But the second set was not Ethan. The bones were older, the build heavier, male, adult, and unknown. Karen sat in stunned silence as the sheriff explained the results. Her mind struggled to process the words, to hold on to any sense of logic. Michael was dead, but Ethan might not be. The news cracked open something inside her that had been buried beneath layers of grief and resignation. She had braced herself for finality. Instead, she was handed a mystery. Where was Ethan, and who had died beside Michael? The questions tumbled through her mind, relentless. Theories once too wild to entertain now seemed painfully plausible. Had Michael met someone in the desert? Had there been a confrontation, a rescue, a betrayal? And if Ethan had survived, who had taken him? Joe was the one who broke the silence that hung between them that night. "This changes everything," he said quietly, his voice lined with a strange kind of hope. "That boy's still out there, somewhere, and someone else was with them." Karen's fingers tightened around the strap of Ethan's backpack. The storm had unburied the past, but it had also unearthed a new beginning. The desert, after years of silence, was telling its story. Not all of it, not yet, but enough to keep her going. Enough to believe that the truth, however painful, however buried, was still waiting to be found. The news that one of the skeletons unearthed beside Michael's belongings wasn't Ethan's didn't bring Karen peace. It set her world spinning in a new and unfamiliar direction. Grief had long been her constant companion, a shadow she'd learned to carry, but now, standing in the sterile room of the county coroner's office, as the lab technician quietly handed her the DNA report, she felt something she hadn't dared to feel in years. Confused, disorienting, even dangerous, but it was there, curling up in her chest like a spark against dry kindling. Ethan wasn't buried in that arroyo. He hadn't died beside his father. Somewhere, he had lived past that day. But if that was true, why hadn't he come back? And who was the man who had died in the desert beside Michael? Karen didn't sleep that night. The storm had passed, but her mind was flooded with questions. She pulled out every paper, every photo, every marked map she had kept from the last. For years now she examined it with fresh eyes. If Michael had died there, and Ethan had not, then Michael must have sent him away. But why? And with whom? That unnamed second body was the key. The sheriff called the next morning with partial news. The other set of remains had a criminal record attached to the DNA match, with a Luis Rivas' last known address in Tucson, a man who had disappeared around the same time Michael and Ethan did. Luis had done time for armed robbery and assault, had been on parole when he vanished. Karen's stomach twisted at the mention of the name. It sounded faintly familiar, like a word from a half-remembered dream. Later that day, while going through Michael's old journal again, she came across a note, scribbled in the margin of a page marked March Supplies. It read simply, "Luis owes me, might be time." The handwriting was tight, the ink faded, but there it was. A name from Michael's past. Suddenly, the pieces began to move. Karen called Joe and read the note aloud to him. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Joe finally said, "Luis Rivas ... I knew that name. He and Michael served together in Iraq. Luis got discharged under suspicion of theft, if I remember right. Michael once told me he saved the guy's life. Never heard from him again after the war." The word "saved" hung heavy in the air. What if Michael had sought Luis out, not because he trusted him, but because he had no other choice? What if the danger wasn't in the desert, but what they were running from before they ever set foot in it? Karen's mind raced. Maybe Michael had discovered something, or maybe someone had discovered him. She dug deeper, using what little she could find online. Luis had a trail of petty crimes, and one major incident that ended in a prison sentence. But there was a blank space in his record the year he vanished. No arrests, no sightings, no missing persons report. It was like he'd been wiped away. But now they knew he had died beside Michael, in that canyon, and his body had been hidden for 4 long years, until the storm uncovered their secret. The sheriff had questions of his own, but without clear evidence of foul play, the case remained a dead end. Karen, however, was far from finished. That night, while flipping through the contents of Michael's backpack, now returned to her from the evidence locker, she found something strange. Hidden in the lining, barely visible through a tear in the fabric, was a tiny pocket. Inside it, wrapped in plastic and sealed tight, was a single folded page. It was stiff and water-stained, but the ink had survived. It was a note, more like a message. Karen unfolded it with trembling fingers and read the words aloud. "He took Ethan north, said he'd keep him safe. I had no choice. If you're reading this, find my son. Tell him I never stopped loving him." Karen's heart nearly stopped. It was a final plea, a confession, a directive. Michael hadn't simply died in the desert, he had made a decision. In the face of something threat violence, fear, he had entrusted Ethan to someone else, to Louise, perhaps the only person he believed could get the boy to safety. And now both men were gone, buried by wind and time. But Ethan could still be out there. Karen pressed the note to her chest. Her eyes filled with tears. She whispered into the quiet room, "I'm coming for you, baby. I promise. I'm not done." She shared the note with the sheriff, who agreed to reopen the case with fresh eyes. It was no longer just a missing persons case, it was now a trail, however faint, of possible survival. Joe was already working through Lucy's known associates, checking names from Michael's past, digging into northern Arizona towns and remote communities where a child could have been hidden without raising questions. Karen felt her body come alive again with urgency, the kind that only a mother's heart could know. She hadn't given birth to Ethan, but she had helped raise him, kissed scraped knees, tucked him in, and held his hand through heartbreak. He was hers in every way that mattered. Michael's last act wasn't surrender, it was sacrifice. And now, it was her turn. It started with a photograph, not a recent one, not even clear, but something about the angle of the boy's jaw. The familiar furrow between the brows, it made Karen's heart stop. The image was buried in the middle of a school newsletter, from a reservation in northern Arizona, dated nearly 3 years prior. Joe had found it while scanning old archives, piecing together any community that Luis Rivas might have had contact with. The boy in the photo wasn't named in the article, but he stood among a group of children planting desert milkweed outside a schoolhouse, his face half turned from the camera. He couldn't have been more than 11. Karen zoomed in until the pixels blurred. She whispered Ethan's name under her breath, not quite believing, not quite ready to let herself, but something deep inside her, older than logic, older than memory, said it was him. They followed the thread, as fragile and uncertain as it was. The reservation didn't keep digitized records, so Karen and Joe drove north. The road narrowed through stretches of red dust and rust-colored messes. Wind whispered across the land like an old song, and the deeper they drove, the more it felt like they were chasing a shadow long past. At the tribal office, they met a woman named Mariah, who oversaw education programs. Her face was kind, but guarded. When Karen showed her the photo and asked if she recognized the boy, Mariah hesitated. "We have a lot of kids come and go," she said cautiously. "Some fostered, some not officially documented. Sometimes they show up with family, sometimes ... not." Karen leaned in, her voice trembling. "Please, I'm not here to cause trouble. I think that boy might be my nephew. He's been missing for 4 years." Mariah studied her, then glanced at Joe. She looked at the photo again and let out a long breath. "I remember him, but he didn't have a name. At least, not one he shared with us. People called him Boy. He came here with an older man, Mexican, rough around the edges. The man said little, claimed they were passing through, but they stayed almost a year. Then one day, they left without warning." Luis. Karen knew it was him. The timeline matched, the behavior fit. She asked if there had been any documentation, any health records, any paper trail at all. Mariah frowned. They kept to themselves. The boy went to class. He was quiet, polite, smart, but he never spoke much about where he came from. Always watched the door, like he was waiting for someone. Karen felt her throat tighten. "Do you remember anything else? Anything at all?" Mariah nodded slowly, then walked to a filing cabinet and pulled out a worn manila folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the only registration they'd ever had on the boy. At the bottom was a hand-drawn doodle of a lizard and, in a child's messy scrawl, a name, E. No last name, just a letter. But it was enough. Karen stared at it, blinking back tears. Her Ethan had loved lizards. He drew them on everything: napkins, birthday cards, his bedroom wall. Mariah explained that the man had been protective, sometimes overly so. He told the boy not to trust anyone, said the world was dangerous, but he wasn't cruel. He fed him, clothed him, even built a little garden behind the trailer they stayed in. The boy worshipped him. Karen sat back, stunned. Whatever Michael had asked of Luis, whatever threat they had fled, it seemed he had honored it. And then, for reasons unknown, he died in that canyon while Ethan survived. But where had Ethan gone? Mariah said there had been rumors. About 6 months after the man and boy disappeared, another traveler came through. A teenage boy, skittish and alone. He camped near the riverbed, never asked for help, just stayed a few nights and left. "I think it was him," she said softly. "He didn't want to be found." Karen and Joe spent the next week chasing stories, talking to ranchers, hikers, travelers. Some remembered a boy who matched Ethan's description. Quiet, brown-haired, tall for his age, with eyes that seemed older than they should have been. One man swore he saw him helping an elderly couple fix a busted water pipe on their land. Another said he worked briefly at a feed store, paid in cash, but he never stayed long, never left a name. They came to know him by the whispers, the boy with no name, the desert ghost. He drifted between towns, careful and quiet, like someone who didn't quite trust the world to hold him. Karen's heart ached with every new detail. He was alive, he had survived, but he was lost in another way now, not in the sand, but in the distance he had built between himself and the life he used to know. Back at the motel, Karen stood at the window and stared into the night. Somewhere out there, her nephew walked under the same stars. Somewhere, he carried the weight of things a child should never have known: his father's death, the fear of being hunted, the silence of never understanding why it had all happened. She thought of Michael's note again. He took Ethan north, said he'd keep him safe. I had no choice. That choice had saved Ethan's life. But now, she had to find him and remind him that he was still loved, still wanted, still someone's boy. Joe stepped beside her, setting down 2 mugs of coffee. "We're close," he said quietly. "Closer than we've ever been." Karen nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're going to bring him home." The town of Holbrook sat quietly at the edge of the desert, where red mesas rose like broken teeth against the sky and trains passed through with a rhythm older than memory. It was a place where people didn't ask too many questions, where the land held more stories than the locals cared to tell. Karen and Joe arrived at sunset, the light spilling gold over cracked pavement and rusted signs. They weren't sure why they had come, only that the trail had led them here. A rancher 2 counties back had spoken of a teenage boy working odd jobs near a mechanic's shop on the outskirts, a kid who matched Ethan's description and vanished without a word when asked where he was from. That was all Karen needed to hear. She was following whispers now, traces of a life just out of reach, and every new detail felt like a breadcrumb dropped by fate. They found the shop easily enough, squat buildings surrounded by junked cars and scattered tools, the smell of oil heavy in the air. The owner, a grizzled man named Pete, with grease-streaked hands and tired eyes, leaned against a toolbox as Karen approached with Ethan's picture trembling in her fingers. He studied it for a long time, then nodded once. "Yeah," he said slowly, "that's him, or close enough. Called himself Jay, came through maybe 2 years ago. Quiet kid, worked hard, didn't say much." Karen's breath caught. "Do you remember where he went?" Pete shook his head. "Just up and left one morning. Didn't take the money I owed him, just vanished." Karen pressed her hand to her chest, trying to steady her racing heart. "Did he ever mention family? His dad?" Pete hesitated, then reached into a drawer and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. "Left this behind. I don't know if it means anything, but he never let it out of his pocket. Figured it mattered." He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small, battered compass brass scratched. The glass fogged at the edge. Karen gasped. It had been Michael's. She remembered Ethan holding it on their last camping trip, turning it over in his palm as his father explained how it always pointed home. Tears sprang to her eyes. Ethan had carried this all those years. It was his tether to a past he didn't understand, a father he'd lost before he could say goodbye. Pete saw the emotion in her face and cleared his throat. "I hope you find him," he said, softer now. "He was a good kid, just ... lost." They stayed the night in a modest motel near the edge of town. Karen sat on the bed, the compass turning slowly in her hand, and thought about the boy her nephew had become. No longer the bright-eyed child drawing dinosaurs on restaurant napkins, but a young man molded by survival, shaped by silence. She wondered what he remembered, what stories he had told himself to make sense of the pain. Did he think his father abandoned him? Did he blame himself? Or had he simply locked it all away? Joe paced near the window, restless. "It doesn't make sense," he said finally. "If Luis was taking him to safety, why didn't they go to the authorities? Why not leave a note, a name, something?" Karen looked up. Maybe they were being followed. Maybe there was more to Luis's past than we knew. The theory wasn't far-fetched. If Michael had turned to Luis as a last resort, it meant he feared someone or something. Karen thought back to the rumors that had swirled in the early days. Debts, enemies, something from the war. Maybe the danger hadn't been the desert. Maybe it had followed them into it. Later that night, unable to sleep, Karen walked to the front office and asked the clerk if any teens had come through in recent weeks. The woman frowned. You mean a runaway? Karen nodded. The woman hesitated, then said, there's been a boy camping out near the wash. Comes into town sometimes for supplies. Never talks. Keeps to himself. Karen's heart jumped. Do you know where? The clerk gave rough directions, circling an area on a faded paper map. They left at dawn. The sky stretched wide and pale, the desert cool beneath a rare overcast veil. Joe drove slowly, eyes scanning the terrain as Karen clutched the compass. When they reached the washer-dry, sun-cracked gully fringed with mesquite, Karen stepped out and called his name. Ethan. Her voice echoed off the canyon wall. Nothing, just wind and silence. But then, movement. A figure stood near a cluster of rocks, tall, thin, a boino, a young man now with dark hair and wary eyes. He didn't run, he didn't speak, he simply watched. Karen stepped forward slowly, heart pounding. Ethan, she whispered. It's me, it's Aunt Karen. The name seemed to hit him like a gust of wind. His eyes widened, but his face stayed still. Karen took another step. Your dad, he loved you so much, he wanted you safe. I've been looking for you for 4 years. The silence stretched unbearably. Then, barely audible, the boy said, I remember you. Just that, but it was enough. She reached into her pocket and held out the compass. His eyes flicked to it. Then slowly, his legs moved. He crossed the space between them like someone walking through water. When he reached her, he took the compass, held it tight, and whispered, I thought I was the only one left. Karen wrapped her arms round him and held on like she'd never let go. He didn't cry. Not when Karen held him, not when she whispered his name like a prayer. Not even when Joe stood quietly to the side, with tears stinging the corners of his weathered eyes. Ethan just stood there, rigid in her embrace, his shoulders tense as though bracing for something, maybe pain, maybe disbelief, maybe both. But Karen didn't let go. She felt his heartbeat through his thin t-shirt, fast and uneven like the wings of a hummingbird. He smelled faintly of desert dust and pine smoke. She hadn't held him since he was 10 years old. Now he was nearly a man, and yet in her arms he was still just a boy who had been too young to be left alone in the dark. I thought you were gone, he said finally, his voice low and scratchy from disuse. Everyone was gone. Karen stepped back to look at him, to search his face for traces of the nephew she remembered. His jaw was sharper now, his eyes older, too old, but beneath the layers of survival, she saw him. I tried to find you, she said softly. I never stopped. Ethan blinked, as if the truth of that didn't quite fit inside the world he'd built to survive. I didn't know what was real anymore, he murmured. Louise said we couldn't trust anyone, that people were looking for us, that if they found us, they'd take me. Karen exchanged a glance with Joe. There it was, again the shadow. Whatever had chased Michael into the desert, whatever ghost from his past had forced him to turn to Louise, it had shaped Ethan's entire life since. Do you know who he meant? She asked gently. Ethan shook his head. He never said. Just told me to stay quiet, keep moving. He said my dad did something, important, something dangerous. Karen tried to keep her voice steady. Your dad died protecting you, Ethan. We found where it happened. We found him. But you, you made it. You're here. The boy's eyes filled with something not quite tears, not quite relief, just the weight of knowing, at last, that someone had kept searching. They sat beneath a bent mesquite tree as clouds drifted across the pale morning sky. Joe brewed weak coffee on a small camp stove, while Ethan picked absently at the edge of his sleeve. I don't remember everything, he said after a long silence. Some things are like dreams. I remember my dad arguing with Louise. It was loud. I was scared. Then, I remember running. Louise carried me on his back. We walked for days. He was hurt. I think someone was following us. He never said it, but I could tell. Karen leaned in. Did you ever see anyone? Ethan nodded slowly. Once. A truck parked on a ridge above us. I saw a man with binoculars. Louise pulled me behind a rock, and we waited until dark to move. He said it was time to split up. Said it was safer. Karen's heart clenched. Michael hadn't been paranoid. There really had been someone after them. But who and why? Joe asked carefully. Do you remember anything else about the truck? A license plate? A logo? Ethan frowned, then shook his head. No, just that it was white. No markings. But it followed us for days. Karen didn't press him. Not yet. He looked like he'd carried those memories for too long, and digging too deep too fast might shatter the fragile threads keeping him whole. Instead, she offered him a peanut butter sandwich from her pack, just like she used to when he was little. He smiled at it faintly, almost shyly, then ate in silence. The sky grew warmer as the sun rose. The land around them, so barren only days, felt alive now. Something had shifted, not just in the earth after the storm, but in the story itself. For years, Karen had chased a mystery. Now the mystery was sitting beside her, eating a sandwich. His hair tangled and his eyes full of a past too heavy for his age. When they drove back into town, Ethan sat quietly in the back seat, watching the horizon like he expected it to disappear at any moment. Karen kept checking the mirror, not to make sure he was still there. She knew he was, but because she couldn't stop looking at him. It was real, he was real, and yet something in his posture told her he wasn't ready to be found. Not entirely. At the motel, they took a room with 2 beds and a couch. Ethan collapsed onto the couch without a word. When he finally slept, he curled into himself like a child hiding from thunder. That night, Karen sat beside him and watched the steady rise and fall of his chest. He had survived so much, more than anyone should have to. But survival came with scars, and some of those scars were invisible. She reached into her bag and took out Michael's note, the one she had found hidden in the backpack. She placed it gently beside him. When he woke in the morning, she wanted him to see it, to know beyond a doubt that his father had never abandoned him. As dawn crept in, Ethan stirred. His hand brushed the paper. He opened it slowly, read it, then read it again. Karen didn't speak. She let him take it in. His shoulders began to shake. Not from fear, not from cold, from release. Tears slipped down his face and he didn't wipe them away. He just whispered, "He didn't leave me." Karen nodded, her own eyes wet. "He gave everything to protect you. And now I'm here, Ethan, I'm here." They left Holbrook the next morning, the car moving slowly down the narrow highway that wound through the desert like a ribbon of memory. The land stretched wide and endless, sun rising behind them, casting long golden fingers across the scrub and stone. Ethan sat in the front seat this time, the compass still gripped in his hand, as if letting go of it might send him spinning back into the fog of the years he had survived alone. Karen didn't push him to talk. She simply drove, each mile folding behind them like pages closing on a long and difficult chapter. Joe followed in a separate car, giving them space, understanding with the quiet wisdom of someone who'd lost and found too much in his own life to rush this fragile moment. At first, Ethan barely spoke. He stared out the window, face unreadable, as if watching a world he used to belong to, but no longer recognized. But as the miles passed, and the landscape turned from red desert to pale grasslands, and familiar shapes of the town he once called home came into view, something in him began to thaw. When they crossed into Prescott County, he shifted in his seat. "That road," he said suddenly, pointing. "Dad used to take it when we went fishing." Karen glanced over, surprised by the sound of his voice. "Yes," she said softly. "Lynx Lake. You loved it there. You and Michael caught the tiniest fish I ever saw, but you wouldn't stop smiling for a week." He smiled faintly at the memory, and Karen held onto that smile like it was a candle flickering in the wind. They stopped at a diner just outside town. She ordered him pancakes with blueberries, just like she used to. Ethan picked at the food at first, uncertain, then began to eat faster, as if realizing no one was going to take it away. A waitress refilled their coffee, glancing at Ethan and then at Karen with the kind of look only people in small towns give when they sense something unspoken but deeply important. No questions were asked. The world, for once, was still. Back at Karen's house, the porch light was on, though the sun was shining. The home hadn't changed much. The same white siding, the same wind chimes clinking gently by the door. But for Ethan, it was as if he was stepping into a dream. He paused before the threshold. Karen stood behind him, giving him space. "It's still your home," she said quietly. "It always was." He nodded and took a deep breath, then stepped inside. The familiar creak of the wooden floor, the scent of lemon and cedar, a framed photo of Michael and Ethan on the mantel. The boy in the picture smiled with crooked teeth and wide, trusting eyes. Ethan stared at it for a long time. "I don't remember that day," he said. "You were 6, Karen replied. "Your dad had just bought that ridiculous grill that never worked. You both ended up eating cereal for dinner." He laughed then, really laughed, a short burst of sound that filled the room like sunlight through open curtains. Karen smiled, her chest aching with the beautiful, painful joy of it. That night, Ethan slept in his old room. She had never changed it, never packed away the toys, or the posters. The bed was too small now, but he curled up in it anyway. Karen stood in the doorway, watching him sleep, and whispered a silent prayer of thanks to Michael for whatever he had done to save Ethan, for the courage it took to trust a man like Luis, and for the message he had left behind that had guided them here. In the days that followed, life didn't return to normal, it reshaped itself. Karen contacted a therapist who specialized in trauma and reunification. Ethan agreed to go, though he barely spoke during the first few sessions. But he went. That was enough. Joe came by often, bringing old fishing gear, maps, and stories about Michael, little pieces of the man Ethan had tried so hard to remember. And slowly, carefully, the boy who had once lived as a ghost began to return to the world. The sheriff's department, with the new evidence and testimony, reopened the case into Michael's death. But the deeper they dug, the more they ran into silence, missing files, names erased, trails that stopped cold. It became clear that whatever Michael had been running from had roots deeper than anyone could prove. And maybe that didn't matter anymore. He had done what mattered most. He had saved his son. One evening, as summer came near and the scent of honeysuckle floated in from the porch, Ethan sat with Karen under the fading light. He held the compass in one hand and a photograph of Michael in the other. "Do you think he was scared?" he asked. Karen looked at him, her voice gentle. "Yes, but I think he was brave too. He made an impossible choice, and because of that, you're here." Ethan nodded, his eyes reflecting the dying light. "I want to go to the canyon, where they found him. I want to say goodbye." Karen reached over and took his hand. "When you're ready, we'll go, together." And so, they waited not for closure, but for healing, for time to soften the jagged edges of the story, for the desert, which had once buried the truth, to stand now as witness to what had been found. Ethan was no longer the boy with no name. He was Michael's son, Karen's nephew, a boy who had been lost but not forgotten. And now, at last, he was home. And so, after years of silence, storms, and searching, what was once lost in the desert has finally been found. Not just a boy, but the love, the courage, and the quiet strength that carried him home. Thank you so much for staying with us through this deeply emotional journey. Your time, your heart, and your presence here truly mean the world to us. If this story moved you in any way, please consider subscribing to the channel so you never miss another powerful tale like this one. Give the video a like if it touched your heart, and don't forget to leave a comment below. Share your thoughts, your feelings, or even your own story. We read every single one, and your words help build a beautiful, supportive community right here. Until next time, take care of yourself and the ones you love. We'll see you in the next story.